could be the most significant trial in the history of Baltimore, and perhaps a legal bellwether, not just for the community, but for the future policing in a city that has devoted itself to it. I'm talking about the upcoming legal proceedings for 6 Baltimore police officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray, a process which begins Monday with the case against Baltimore officer William Porter. Porter is facing charges of manslaughter, assault, and reckless endangerment, but even more significant is a role Porter might play later, as prosecutors have deemed him a key witness against 5 other officers charged in Gray's death. To help me sort out the legal issues and potential implications of 6 consecutive trials in a city already tense about their outcome are 2 people with both political and policing experience. State Delegate Jill Carter has been a longtime advocate for policing reforms during her decade-long career in the state legislature. And Stephen Tabling is a former homicide lieutenant in the Baltimore Police Department. He was also one of the first detectives to investigate use of force cases. Thank you both for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just to start out with, we were talking before we got started, was, we have 6 trials coming up in the Freddie Gray case, and this sort of poses a certain burden on the city. You were talking about you're worried about the city, you're worried about the legal proceedings, and maybe to a certain extent, the lack of the legal system to be able to certainly, adjudicate this in a way that would be satisfactory. Talk a little about what your concerns are in this case.
Well, the legal system can only mete out what's charged. And so, of course, the first concern that I have and other people have raised is the fact that we're talking about 6 police officers going on trial for the homicide death of Freddie Gray, but all of the charges happen kind of in the middle of the incident when the state's attorney first came out and made an announcement that she was charging, her office was charging. She said very clearly this was an illegal arrest and that these police officers would be charged with the death of Freddie Gray. But we all saw from the video that there was an assault that happened prior to Freddie Gray ever being placed in a van. And if, in fact, there was an illegal arrest that resulted in or that was contemporaneous with an assault, I would argue that would be the first-degree assault and attempted murder. Those charges should have started with those officers right there outside the van, and then everything else continued with the cumulative effect of charges, cumulative charges for everything that ensued after that.
Well, see, you said that they had a right to chase him and that you believe the rest is legal. Could you explain that? Because a lot of people would take issue with that.
Well, I think it's a decision for the court to make, but based on Terry versus Ohio, I believe that at the time, the place, the location, and knowing this individual, that they had a right based on Terry versus Ohio. They had articulable, reasonable suspicion to stop him and pat him down. Now, what happened after the original pat down is another issue. But, I think that's a question for the court to answer. But based on all the information, they certainly had a right to detain Freddie Gray.
To chase him? Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, yes, but he had not at that point committed any crime on view that they could see. Why would they have the right to chase him?
You don't have to have a crime committed in your presence for a Terry stop. It's the time, the location. If you've had the person in the past for having weapons or similar things like that, and they're in a neighborhood at the time, it's a high drug area or whatever it is, that you have a right to do that. There's a case called Wardall versus the United States, a similar type thing where they chased this guy through a housing project because they knew him in the past of what he had done, and they patted him down. The Supreme Court upheld that case. But the issues I have here, and I don't know everything. Did they have a right? Yeah. What happened after that? I think this is going to be a case for the court to decide. But the other issue I have is having multiple investigators working on a case. Right. That's another big issue that I have.
Well, we'll get to that. Jill, we were talking about before. I had talked to Attorney Warren Brown, who said he thought it was impossible for these officers to actually get a fair trial because of the attendant sort of controversy, that people would be afraid to acquit the officers regardless of the evidence. What do you think of that assertion?
I actually disagree. I think that, first of all, I have a lot of faith in Baltimore City jurors, and I think that we're not monolithic. I think that just as many people that are as upset about and have already formed an opinion that the police acted improperly, there are also many, many people in the city that think that the police either acted properly or don't want to question what the police did because they believe it's more important that we protect the officers because we expect them to protect us. So I think that we're going to have a very mixed jury pool, And I really don't think that any juror, potential juror, is going to make a decision of guilty or not guilty based on their feeling of whether this is going to cause more uprising or not. They're going to do it based on the evidence that's presented to them.
Well, one of the things we talked about, the defense was trying to get 10 peremptory challenges on the jury selection, but it doesn't look like they're going to get that. How would that affect?
They shouldn't get it.
Why not?
It's actually even, I think it's outrageous that they would even ask for that.
What's the significance of that, just so people understand? You either get 5 or 10 challenges. What does that mean,
Well,
basically?
normally the state will get the 10 challenges because and usually the officers are with the state. And the reason that they get it is that they have the burden of proof.
Right.
And so the defense gets usually 5 or less than the state.
Which means they can dismiss a juror for any reason? Is that what it means?
Yeah, the peremptory challenges are where you don't have to have any reason, you just don't have to like them.
Yeah.
But the for cause, they still have the same for cause strikes regardless.
Right. So even if they don't use the they can have for cause, right?
What the defense is doing is they're trying to, in essence, get a change of venue because they're trying to like really be so meticulous in selection of the jury pool.
That there's no jurors left.
Exactly.
Yeah. So see, to get back to the investigation. Now, it was interesting, we talked about this. The Baltimore Sun reporter was basically embedded with police. So how can the prosecutors trust the police investigation when there's a reporter watching everything that's going on?
Well, I really had an issue with that. I never in my career heard of a reporter being associated with the police while they're doing the investigation. I personally, from an investigator viewpoint, I think that's going to be a problem. You don't have outside people on your interrogation, and in line with that, I have an issue with the way the investigation was conducted. Right. Anytime you have multiple units investigating a case, you create a great big long chain of evidence, and you can never get to the bottom of it. In the years going by, I had responsibility for investigating police shootings. I did it myself with one detective, because if you can keep that short chain, you're better off. Yeah. And look what happened here. The Sheriff's Department, the State's Attorney's Office, and the Homicide Squad. And now investigating police shootings, they have a 30-person squad, if it's correct what I read in the paper. And anytime you get all those people involved, I think you have a problem.
Well, one thing though, you're a prosecutor trying to do this case, and you see that they have a reporter embedded, and you see they have 30 people. Why shouldn't you just do your own investigation? Why should you trust the police to do the investigation? Which is what normally happens, which is what happened here. Why should you trust them?
Well, I'm not there anymore.
I know.
And I wasn't there during the investigation, but I would not conduct an investigation that way. I conducted numerous investigations, and I never had multiple people with me. When Palmer Lowe was commissioner, he gave me full responsibility for all police shootings. We never had a lot of problems. Just think of how many people is going to be involved if what I read in the paper is right, with all these different. Anytime you get a half a dozen detectives involved in a case and you exclude them from the courtroom, you may have a problem. There's too many hands in there.
So, Delegate Carter, one thing that came up in the motions was that Mr. Porter wants to call like 25 character witnesses. From your just outside looking in as a defense attorney, what could be the point of having so many character witnesses? I mean, is it a way to sort of lead the jury astray from the evidence? Is it a way of saying we don't have anything to challenge the evidence? We're just going to make it seem like he was a really nice guy. What do you think?
Clearly, but I think I think that's also just about as outrageous as the peremptory strikes, because I think that first of all, we don't even know for sure that he's going to testify, and if he doesn't testify, then there'd be no reason, of course, for that. But normally, a character witness wouldn't even come in. You're looking at the people that can testify to the direct evidence, the investigators and the like. So first, I don't think that motion, I'm assuming, hasn't been ruled upon, and I don't think that it'll be allowed.
No, the judge allowed it, actually.
Well, it did, 25 character witnesses.
I mean, that's what I read, in the Sun website. I was not there, but, it did say that, he's going to allow, he's not going to put any limits on the character witnesses. So, and also that Porter's going to be able to testify himself. Is that a good strategy? I mean, to me, it seems like they're trying to formulate a strategy that's going to sort of not be about evidence, but about his character.
I think so. Interesting, because I think that we can speculate all we want, but what happens in the courtroom is often something that takes on a life of its own.
Absolutely.
And I think that it could be actually very damaging to him to testify, because I think that while it's my understanding that he will testify to the fact that he reported that Freddie Gray needed help, or he heard Freddie Gray call for help,
Right.
or whatever. I think that he sets himself up for neglect of his own duty.
Yeah.
You know, his own responsibility. He had more of responsibility as a person that wears the badge and carries the gun and is charged with protecting and serving, more than just to file a report. He had a responsibility to do something about it. So I think he could actually put himself in more harm by testifying.
Steve, we have talked about a lot. You and I have argued about the manslaughter charges. You feel like they're going to be very hard to prove, and you feel like maybe the prosecutor might have gone too far. I know you don't know all the evidence, but from your experience in dealing with manslaughter cases, or the second-degree murder cases, specifically second-degree murder, what do you think are the problems that could come up during it?
Just from an investigator.
Right, I
Just
understand.
they've got to prove in second-degree murder that there was some kind of malice. They got to prove that he had his intent, what his intent was to do. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm an investigator, and I think that would be very difficult to prove second-degree murder with the guy driving the van. They might have something else, I don't know. But you got to prove intent on crimes like that. And as you and I talked, maybe they overcharged and they could have went back with lesser charges and they'd have had a better opportunity than try to load up on everything.
Joe, we were talking about before we started a little bit about what this case is about beyond just the legal proceedings, in terms of what it means about policing. And you were talking about how that these officers are sort of become symbols of something a little bit larger than just a specific case. What do you mean by that? What does this case mean for policing at large in terms of how it's been prosecuted in this city for decades at this point?
It's interesting, and as Mr. Tabling just talked about, the difficulty in maybe proving the second-degree murder because of the malice issue. I believe that the malice comes in with something that's a little illusory, a little difficult to prove, a little intangible, with the fact that there was a dehumanization of Freddie Gray in the minds of the police, in the minds of this society, and that probably the malice is because he was a poor, lead-poisoned young black man with a criminal history that had no value in the eyes of the police officers, who often treat other similar young men the same way and get away with it all the time. That is difficult to prove, but that's an indictment on the police, the whole Baltimore Police Department. And what I hope that will come out of this is that that will change. Yeah. I'm not that optimistic, though, because I don't know that these charges, I don't know that there'll be convictions for that.
Right. Well, Steve, that's leads me to this question that I've asked you before, and I got to ask you again. I mean, he was alive and healthy before he was arrested, and he was dead an hour later, his neck severed. How is that legal? You're a cop.
I'm a cop, but I'm not talking about any legalities. You're saying, how did that happen? Well, it's up to the medical examiner and the information the medical examiner has, and they get together with the police and they talk to him about the case, and they look at the situation where the guy was arrested, and based on all that information, the medical examiner has to make a determination. Was it a homicide or was it an accidental? And I understood at first she said it was accidental. And then there was a meeting, and I'm talking about the medical examiner, and then there was a meeting and it came out as a homicide. I've never seen that happen, Steve.
You never consulted with a medical examiner, brought new evidence?
No.
Seriously, it's never changed?
No, you consult with the medical examiner. But when we went out on a crime scene, we'd make an anatomy sheet, and we had to attend the autopsies, and the medical examiner would say, "Detective, tell me what you saw." And you tell him what you saw, and it gave him a starting point.
But once you handcuff a person and they're in your custody, aren't you responsible for their safety?
Well, you're responsible for their safety when you arrest them.
So, I mean, it does seem that they did something wrong in this continuum of events.
Well, again, I'm not part of the investigation.
Right.
I wasn't on the street to really see what happened. All I can go by is what I read, and it's a lot of conflicting stuff that comes out in the papers, and you can't believe everything. But what really got me is when I read that whole story and found out that there was a reporter with them all the way during the whole investigation.
Well, just to wrap it up, Delegate Carter, you have been an advocate for police reform for forever, however long I've known you, and yet nothing happened in Annapolis last year, and then, of course, this work group. Is there any hope for police reform in the light of what you're talking about, where this Freddie Gray case represents a need to change the philosophy of policing. But is there any hope that we get reform? And if not, what do we need to do?
Based on what we have before us now, with the legislature still not taking the issue seriously, and really, really working toward legitimate reform, just trying to, make, I think they're trying to create a pretext of reform. And then this Freddie Gray case, I wouldn't pin all of our hopes and dreams on it. We can't do that. I think that the problem is, and you just mentioned it, this young man is in police custody and he's seemingly healthy and then he's dead. Well, this is so often. This happens so often. This happened with Tyrone West. It certainly happened with Anthony Anderson, where there was the declaration of a homicide. So, I guess my concern and fear is that just because there's a declaration of a homicide and there's police action or inaction that results ultimately in death, I'm not certain that it's going to rise to the level before the jury or the evidence is going to be presented in court to prove beyond a reasonable doubt criminal conduct on behalf of the police and not just negligence or even gross negligence, which is civil liability.
Yeah. Well, listen, Delegate Carter, Lieutenant Timmy, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. We'll continue this discussion soon as the trial unfolds. My name is Stephen Janis, and I'm a reporter for the Real News Network in Baltimore.